You see, in matters like this, repetition changes everything. One breach is an incident, two breaches are a pattern, and patterns are warnings. So, as the country prepared for Christmas, believing its symbols of stability were safe behind iron gates and trained eyes, the truth was far more disturbing. Because this wasn't just trespassing, this was a warning. To understand why this incident sent quiet shockwaves through the heart of Britain's establishment, you first have to understand who it involved and where it happened. Prince William and Princess Catherine are not just senior royals. Over the last decade, they have come to represent something far deeper in the public imagination: stability, continuity, a carefully crafted image of calm leadership in an era where institutions feel increasingly fragile. To many, they are the future-facing anchor of the monarchy, measured, modern, and deeply conscious of public trust. That is precisely why the location matters. Kensington Palace is often spoken of as if it were a museum, historic, distant, ceremonial. But in reality, it is something very different. It is a living royal compound. Behind its walls are private apartments, offices, gardens, security posts, and daily routines. It is home to multiple members of the royal family, as well as staff who work there every day. Children have grown up inside its grounds. Life happens there, quietly, routinely, and away from public view. Apartment 1A, famously associated with the Prince and Princess of Wales, is their London base. While they now live primarily within the grounds of Windsor Castle, their presence at Kensington Palace remains symbolically and operationally significant. Even when they are not in residence, the palace does not become dormant. Security protocols remain active. The assumption is constant protection, uninterrupted, absolute. Now add the timing. Late December, the Christmas season, a period when security expectations are at their highest. Royal residences are not just symbols during Christmas, they are focal points. Visibility increases, risks are reassessed. Every movement, every perimeter, every shift is meant to be tighter, not looser. This is the moment when vigilance should be at its peak. And that is what makes this story impossible to dismiss as a minor incident. Responsibility for protecting royal sites in London falls to the Metropolitan Police, specifically its Royal and Specialist Protection Command, a unit tasked with safeguarding the monarchy against threats both obvious and unseen. These officers are trained not just to react, but to anticipate. Their role is preventative, silent, relentless. Which is why the facts of this case immediately raise uncomfortable questions. A man was found inside the palace grounds. Then, days later, he was found there again. This shifts the narrative entirely. What might have been written off as an isolated breach begins to resemble something more troubling: a lapse, a vulnerability, a system tested and found wanting, not through chaos or force, but through repetition. You see, in royal security, context is everything. The absence of harm does not equal the absence of danger. Sometimes the most serious failures are the ones that unfold quietly, without spectacle, without warning sirens, without public panic. And that is what makes this story impossible to dismiss as a minor incident. Responsibility for protecting royal sites in London falls to the Metropolitan Police, specifically its Royal and Specialist Protection Command, a unit tasked with safeguarding the monarchy against threats both obvious and unseen. These officers are trained not just to react, but to anticipate. Their role is preventative, silent, relentless. Which is why the facts of this case immediately raise uncomfortable questions. A man was found inside the palace grounds. Then, days later, he was found there again. This shifts the narrative entirely. What might have been written off as an isolated breach begins to resemble something more troubling: a lapse, a vulnerability, a system tested and found wanting, not through chaos or force, but through repetition. You see, in royal security, context is everything. The absence of harm does not equal the absence of danger. Sometimes the most serious failures are the ones that unfold quietly, without spectacle, without warning sirens, without public panic. And that is what makes this story impossible to dismiss as a minor incident. The story doesn't begin with an arrest. It begins quietly, almost routinely, on December 21. On that day, officers carrying out standard security duties within the grounds of Kensington Palace noticed something that didn't belong. A man was inside the palace gardens, not near the public perimeter, not at a distance. Inside, close enough to trigger an immediate response from those trained to treat every anomaly as a potential threat. He was stopped, identified, removed. On paper, it may have looked like a contained incident, a breach, yes, but one resolved before harm could occur. In most cases, that would be the end of the story. A warning issued, details logged, security reviewed. The system, having detected a problem, adjusts and closes ranks. But this story doesn't end there, because just 2 days later, on December 23, it happened again. This same man, the same royal grounds, the same palace. This time, the implications were impossible to ignore. Repetition changes everything in security analysis. It transforms coincidence into intent, curiosity into persistence, and intrusion into escalation. The man was identified as Derek Egan, 39 years old. Details about his background remain limited, but his behavior spoke loudly enough. He had already been discovered once. He knew the area was protected. He understood, at least on some level, that his presence was neither permitted nor unnoticed. And yet, he returned. That alone is what triggered serious concern among those familiar with royal protection procedures. After a first breach, security measures are typically reassessed immediately. Patrol patterns change, attention sharpens, known individuals are flagged. The goal is simple: prevent re-entry at all costs. Which is why a second breach is not just rare, it's extraordinary. Royal residences are not casual targets. They are layered environments, protected by physical barriers, surveillance, and human judgment working in tandem. Most would-be intruders are detected long before they ever reach inner grounds. Those who do are almost never able to repeat the act. That is what makes this case so unsettling. Egan was reportedly carrying a heavy rucksack, a detail that, in security terms, cannot be overlooked. Even when nothing is found, the presence of an unknown bag fundamentally changes the risk assessment. It forces officers to consider possibilities they would rather never have to imagine. And yet, the story remains defined not by what happened, but by what could have happened. Historically, the royal family has faced moments that reshaped how security is viewed. Without sensationalism, it's enough to say that past security scares, some decades old, have left a lasting imprint on how seriously threats are taken today. Each incident reinforced one core principle: prevention is everything. That's why repeated access is almost unheard of. And that's why this case struck such a nerve behind closed doors. Because the system did what it was designed to do. It noticed him, it identified the breach, it intervened. But it didn't stop him from coming back. And in the world of royal security, that distinction matters more than anything. There were no dramatic scenes, no public chaos, no immediate danger to the family, who were believed to be away at the time. But safety is not measured only by outcomes. It's measured by resilience, by whether a system can adapt faster than a threat can persist. In this case, the timeline raised a troubling possibility that someone tested the boundaries, found gaps, and walked through them twice. And once that realization sets in, the story can no longer be treated as an odd footnote. It becomes something else entirely. A warning not ignored, but understood too late. At the center of this story, beneath the headlines, beyond the palace walls, lies a detail that security professionals cannot ignore: the rucksack.
To the public, it may sound ordinary, but to those trained in royal protection, an unknown bag carried into protected grounds instantly changes the equation. A rucksack represents uncertainty, weight, concealment, possibility. It forces officers to assume nothing and consider everything. Even when no weapon or device is found, the risk assessment shifts from presence to potential. And when that rucksack appears not once, but twice, the concern deepens. This is where fear quietly replaces routine. Because the charges that followed were not framed as a misunderstanding or a harmless lapse, Derek Egan faced 2 counts of trespassing, tied directly to December 21 and December 23. On their own, trespass charges can appear minor, but in this context, within royal grounds, involving repeated access, the implications reach far beyond property boundaries. This is where national security enters the conversation. Royal residences are not private homes in the conventional sense. They are symbolic centers of the state. Any intrusion, especially one repeated after intervention, forces authorities to consider whether intent could escalate. That is why this case was not treated as a simple breach, and why it began moving through a far more serious legal process. When Egan appeared before the court, the drama shifted from palace gardens to the justice system. Inside the courtroom, according to reports, his behavior was volatile. He shouted abuse while in the dock, disrupting proceedings and challenging the authority of the court itself. That conduct alone raised red flags, but what followed only intensified concerns. Egan was reportedly scheduled to appear at Bromley Magistrates Court on Christmas Eve. Instead, he refused to leave the prison van. The hearing could not proceed as planned. In legal terms, this is more than non-compliance. It is a signal, a sign that the individual may be unpredictable, uncooperative, and unwilling to engage with restraint or instruction. For judges and prosecutors, behavior matters almost as much as evidence. The question of bail quickly became central. Could someone who had already returned to royal grounds after being stopped once be trusted to not do so again? Could assurances outweigh demonstrated persistence? The answer, in this case, was no. The court was told there was a real risk of reoffending. That concern is critical in cases involving protected sites. The threshold for caution is far lower. The margin for error is razor thin. And so, bail was denied. This was no longer about what had happened, but about what might happen next. Adding weight to the concern was the voice of experience. Former head of the Metropolitan Police's Royal and Specialist Protection Branch, Di Davies, did not mince his words. He pointed directly to the repetition of the offending as the core issue. Being caught once and returning again, he warned, gives serious cause for concern. In royal protection, repetition is rarely accidental. Davies's assessment reflected a reality understood by those who guard high-profile targets. Threats do not always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they probe, they test, they repeat, and each repetition gathers information about response times, patrol patterns, weaknesses. This is what turns an intrusion into a security case. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were weighing the stakes carefully. The Crown Prosecution Service confirmed that the charges required Attorney General consent. That requirement exists for a reason. It acknowledges that some cases, especially those involving the royal family, carry implications beyond standard criminal law. They touch on national security, public confidence, and institutional integrity. Before prosecution could proceed fully, the Attorney General needed to consider whether moving forward could expose further security risks. Even the legal process itself had to be handled with caution. And through all of this, one truth became increasingly clear. This was not chaos. There was no sudden breach of force, no dramatic confrontation, no public danger narrowly avoided. What made this case so troubling was its quiet nature, the methodical return, the unchanged target, the persistence despite intervention. Security systems are built to stop single failures. They are tested by patterns. And here, a pattern had emerged.
Each layer, police response, courtroom behavior, expert warning, prosecutorial caution, pointed to the same conclusion. This was not a harmless anomaly. It was a stress test of royal security, carried out not with violence, but with insistence. The man was noticed, he was removed, he was charged, and yet the damage had already been done, not in lives lost or harm caused, but in confidence shaken, because the question now facing authorities was no longer what did he do, it was far more uncomfortable than that. Why didn't the system stop him the first time? And once that question takes hold, accountability follows close behind.
The turning point in this story did not come at the palace gates. It came under fluorescent lights, inside a courtroom built for order, restraint, and final decisions. At Westminster Magistrates' Court, the narrative shifted decisively. What had begun as an unsettling breach of royal grounds now entered a phase where the system was forced to respond, not cautiously, not quietly, but fully. This was no longer a question of what happened. It was a question of what must happen next. Derek Egan's appearance before the court was anything but routine. Reports described a man who did not cooperate with the process designed to assess him. He shouted abuse, disrupting proceedings. His behavior was not merely inappropriate, it was destabilizing. In a legal environment where conduct signals risk, this mattered deeply. And then came the moment that changed everything. Egan refused to leave the prison van for a scheduled hearing. No negotiation, no compliance. The court could not proceed as planned. In response, the judge made a rare but telling decision. The case would move forward in his absence. That decision carried weight far beyond procedure. When a court chooses to proceed without the defendant present, it marks a loss of personal agency. The system takes control. The process continues regardless of participation. It is an acknowledgement that the individual's behavior has crossed a threshold where accommodation is no longer possible. Presiding over the case was Sam Guzzi, who made the court's position unmistakably clear. Bail was denied. The reasoning was firm, measured, and rooted in risk. The judge stated there was a real possibility of a custodial sentence if Egan were convicted. More importantly, the court was not satisfied that he could be trusted to remain compliant or to refrain from further offending if released. This was the moment inevitability set in. Up until now, the story could still be framed, however uncomfortably, as an incident, an intrusion, a lapse that raised questions but allowed for interpretation. The denial of bail closed that door. It signaled that the legal system now viewed the case through a different lens. Not curiosity, not confusion, but containment. And with that shift came a deeper reclassification. This was no longer about a man who wandered where he shouldn't have. The language changed. The tone hardened. The focus moved away from trespass and toward threat assessment. The repeated breaches, the heavy rucksack, the courtroom behavior, the refusal to cooperate, all of it combined into a picture that demanded seriousness. What underscored the gravity even further was a legal detail rarely discussed outside specialist circles. The charges required Attorney General approval. That requirement exists only in cases where broader security considerations are at play. It acknowledges that prosecution itself can carry risk of exposure, risk of precedent, risk of signaling vulnerabilities. Before the case could advance fully, the Attorney General needed to consider whether moving forward could introduce new dangers for the royal family or the institutions tasked with protecting them. In other words, even justice had to pause and assess the landscape. For those watching closely, this confirmed what many had already suspected. The case had crossed into national significance, not because of spectacle, not because of violence, but because of persistence, unpredictability, and symbolic proximity to the heart of the monarchy. And then came the moment where everything crystallized. At this point, this was no longer about trespassing. It was about the credibility of royal security, about public trust in systems designed to prevent the unthinkable,
about how modern institutions respond when threats do not arrive loudly, but quietly, testing boundaries again and again. The courtroom became a mirror of that reality, calm on the surface, controlled in tone, but beneath it an unmistakable acknowledgement. Something had gone wrong, and it could not be undone by dismissal or minimization. The system had been patient, it had observed, it had documented. Now it reacted, and once the machinery of law, security, and national oversight begins moving in unison, there is no return to normalcy. The narrative locks into place. The outcome becomes a matter of when, not if. This was the moment the story stopped being about how someone got in and became about what happens when they shouldn't have been able to at all.